Hey. Ever since my first psychotic break, I've wondered what the difference is between psychosis and mysticism. What differentiates a person who is clinically insane from a person who has been touched by the gods? Like many people who investigate this when they are experiencing a psychotic break, I didn't really do it for the most noble of intentions. No, I just didn't want to be crazy. I didn't want to be like those people who had bizarre ideas and were completely disconnected from reality. Therefore, different narratives seemed appealing because they gave me an explanation that didn't just make me not crazy, but also made me saner than the general population, or indeed even religious people who hadn't experienced the divine in the way that I had. This shows a fundamental lack of charity and love, not just towards other people, but also towards myself. I was so worried about the stigma of psychosis. I was so disinclined to accept the possibility that I could be ill that any other explanation seemed infinitely preferable to that one. Even a solution that involved being tormented in afterlives designed to punish non-believers for eternity, that, temporarily, seemed more appealing than being crazy. That's an incredible amount of stigma, an incredible amount of fear, and spoke to a very real desire to set myself apart from my fellow human beings, both the sane and the insane, the religious and the secular alike. Which means, amusingly enough, because I didn't want to be one of those crazies, I imagined myself holy, and while I was imagining myself holy, I was demonstrating the sins of pride and greed, and the desire to be superior to the people that, according to the religion that I followed at the time, I ought to want to serve, love, and understand instead. That's pretty epic fail. You see it a lot in the spiritual gurus, mind you, but definitely not doing religion right when that's what you're doing. But it's still an interesting question. What is the relationship between mysticism and psychosis? Well, I've come to quite a few different conclusions on that, one of which is the appeal to function levels, which I talk about in this video, and one of which is the ability to integrate within communities, which I talk about in this video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how my reflections on autism helped me understand schizophrenia and this particular question. Schizophrenia, like autism, is a spectrum, and they're both spectrums that have a lot of different types of conditions, a lot of subtypes of conditions, and very different idiosyncratic manifestations in every person that has either neurotype. Let's not call them disorders, in everyone who has those neurotypes. For example, a person with autism, I'm talking about me here, can be extremely high in light and sound sensitivity, while not suffering as much from the depression and anxiety that are pervasive in people who have autism. And a person on the schizophrenia spectrum can, for example, hallucinate constantly. I'm talking about myself again. But be relatively low on the scale of delusions, have relatively little of that in their particular presentation. And of course, this can vary over time within one individual, not just between individuals. They're both very, very diverse clusters of symptoms and behaviors and thought processes that differ from what we find in the majority of the population. Autism, at least, is increasingly being viewed as a different form of neurological functioning from the norm. We've come to understand it that way to such a degree that now we don't only collapse all of the different types of autism into one spectrum, we also acknowledge broad autism phenotype, which is a person who has many of the traits and features of autism and autistic thinking and behavior patterns, but their presentation is not sufficiently intense or not sufficiently disabling to warrant a diagnosis with any degree of autism. But if you braid two together, you're very, very likely to wind up with an autistic child. You see this, for example, in Silicon Valley and in any area that has a lot of intellectual, obsessive people within it, because that's where we tend to excel. We focus very, very much on very, very few things, and that can have advantages. Future me here. While the genetic discussion is correct, the connection to Silicon Valley and high education is based upon old and at this point outdated data. For a while, we were seeing autism rates spike specifically in those locations and demographics. But more recently, we've seen autism spike in the lower classes and particularly in racial minorities. Some researchers believe that this points to environmental factors that are coming into play and are being avoided by the wealthier people in our population. And I think that's quite likely. But it's equally possible that access to diagnostics has only recently hit the lower classes and the Black populations in the United States. We won't know for a while. There's actually a lot of complexity to this, but that's beyond the scope of this particular video. For now, the basic premise that if one person who is broadly autistic mates with another person with broad autism phenotype, they do have a much higher chance of having an autistic child than to people with no signs of autism at all, because genetics remain a very strong variable here. Schizophrenia is similarly heritable, and just like with autism, there's nuance here as well. Genetics absolutely play a significant role in who develops schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, but we also know that environmental factors are also a major factor here. So, lots of genes, environmental factors, you need both if you're going to get schizophrenia and, as we discussed earlier, possibly autism as well. In particular, the VMA2 gene, and I really oversimplified this on my first take, half knowingly, but I want to correct it a little bit now. We have currently identified over 120 genes that contribute to the development of schizophrenia. Similarly, we know that lots of different genes contribute to autism. And it's generally agreed that any mental health condition requires both genetic predispositions and environmental factors to come to fruition and become an actually disabling condition. VMAT2 is definitely implicated in schizophrenia, and what's really special about that particular gene is that its associated receptor can be targeted to reduce the possibility of getting tardive dyskinesia and to reduce the dosage of antipsychotics that individual people with psychosis might need. Tardive dyskinesia happens in 15 to 30% of people taking current antipsychotics. So having drugs that target VMAT2 that can either reduce the odds of that or potentially eliminate it if we can really focus on that to the exclusion of other dopamine receptors without causing the fresh flowering of psychotic symptoms would be pretty awesome, but we don't know where that research is going to go yet, so yeah. Interestingly, that same gene producing those same effects, but not quite as intensely, has also been implicated in religiosity and religiosity's inheritability, or so Seth Dean Hamer in his book, The God Gene. That book, it's pop psychology or pop neurology, depending on how you want to actually look at it. There is a roughly 0% chance that religiosity, or indeed any other trait, is reducible to one gene. That's just not how humanity works. And we also know that environment definitely plays a role, both in religiosity and in people's traits generally, as we were talking about with autism and schizophrenia a little bit earlier. But he does implicate it with regard to self-transcendence, which he uses as a marker for religiosity. This is not novel to him. Various cultures have done it over the course of history, and Aldous Huxley is actually where I first learned about it in his discussion of the perennial philosophy. I certainly think it's the case that any genes that predispose people to that particular experience or to desiring that experience is likely going to raise their desire for religion and to practice religion. We also know from other research that a desire for community and a propensity to existential questioning also predisposes people to want to be religious, and we suspect there are genetic components to that too. It's not all cultural. Almost nothing is all cultural. Well, almost nothing is all cultural that we see in almost all cultures on Earth anyway. All right, I think we have enough precision on that to go on to the original video. You see where this is going, right? Yeah, I thought you did. Religiosity is characterized by a tendency towards community formation, existential questioning, and self-transcendence, all components of how we interact with others. Much of that is driven by a desire to transcend and transform the ego, and ego disturbances, for good and for ill, unfortunately, are a noted component in schizophrenia. It's actually one of the earliest components noticed in schizophrenia. The symptomology remains in people with the disorders, and it's certainly something experienced by most people who have brief psychotic breaks. And it is also something we see as a core component of religion. Much of the goal of religion is to identify not as oneself, but as all, as your brother, as your God, as the world that we all care for together and sustain for the enjoyment of future generations. In particular, religious attainment usually involves feeling that unity, feeling the connection between oneself and those one serves, oneself and those who help us, oneself and the world. Anyone can think about it. But to feel in your bones, in your soul, in your heart, that transformative connection with things that aren't the you that everyone tells you are, that's what's special. That's what may take certain genetic markers, or at least a certain quantity of genetic markers, to accomplish. And I think it's a good thing. So my theory is that the natural tendency towards religiosity is basically the same thing as the schizophrenia spectrum, as the genetic markers that make schizophrenia more likely to develop. Just as there are people who are autistic-like, but not on the autism spectrum, there are people who are schizophrenia-like, but not schizophrenic, and we call them religious. That's not at all meant to insult religious people or psychotic people. Religion is one of the integral aspects of our civilization. It is how we gather together in such large numbers that we were able to conquer the entire world. And while I wouldn't blame you for not being ecstatic about how we've handled that, the ability to transcend our individual nature and join with others and with a higher being or a higher purpose is certainly a benefit to our species. It allows us to perform more abstract and communal goals than might have been possible otherwise. Psychosis, the religious impulse, those genes that lead us to venerate something larger than ourselves and act in service of larger things than ourselves and each other and the community, all of which is likely the same cluster of genes. Just like autism is a good thing, as long as you don't get so many of the genes together that you end up with serious disabilities and the quality of life declines in consequence. These are not bad neurotypes to have. And once you realize that they're the same thing, if you're having visions, it becomes less important to think about the difference between schizophrenia or religiosity. They're the same. And because they're the same, you can be as proud as a mystic or as cautious about what you experience as a person who is self-aware about their own psychosis, which is an excellent balance. It allows you to go into those altered states of consciousness that your mind is so prone to naturally, learn everything there is to learn there, and bring it back in a way that others can partake in and enjoy and grow from and learn from as well. Which is, of course, the journey of every shaman, of every mystic, of every religious saint who toils in the realm beyond this physical world that we share. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's the same thing. And it can be good. Okay. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.